Without any further ado, because there's already been much ado about very little, um, let's start this 10th and final brown bag talk in the series. It's been my pleasure to be able to do this series, to be able to talk to you all like this, and it's been interesting to share your reactions. I hope that more of you will feel free to share your reactions with me going forward, whether you're watching it live today or whether you're watching this sometime in the unknown future. Um, the videos are available on the company's website and on my own YouTube channel. And I really appreciate any feedback that you care to give. So I look forward to hearing from you. Now, once again, today we're starting with the same lovely icon by Jonathan Anderson that I'll mention again stems out of the work that Jonathan and Nico Bryan and myself were doing at Evolve, work on finding icons to represent simple heuristics or simple unthinking patterns in the user experience of using any graphic user interface. Now, it's appropriate at last to have this icon here because this is our icon for cognitive friction, which is the topic of our talk today. How and why does difficulty add up? And in my usual way, we're going to be talking about that, but we're going to be coming at it in a sort of a roundabout way. And I've got a few stories to tell you, and we're going to take a little walk together like we always do. And we're going to start in the usual way by taking a look at what's come before. Of course, this time, that list that we start with today is a little bit longer than it's been in the past. So I'm going to try to go through it fairly quickly, but not so quickly as to hurt the perception of what comes next for those people who haven't had a chance to go through every step. So a quick summary of what we've talked about so far in inverted or reverse order. So to start, our current measurements, our current mental models, our current way of thinking, each of us individually or as a group, if it happens to be biased, and it is, just for those of you who missed the earlier talks, it's definitely biased. If it happens to be biased, then the best way to improve any of those things are the measurements we use, the mental models or mental maps that we follow, the cultural norms that we follow. The best way to improve any of them is something that Piaget called sociogenesis. And that's a lovely complex word that just means an idea that comes from outside of your own thoughts. So ideas from outside of our own thoughts are the best way to fix our own biases. And another idea we talked about is that it's possible to measure facts and to use them to understand the emotional experiences of others, despite the fact that those experiences are not universal. And it could be that two people watching this video, for example, could have completely different experiences of the video itself, completely different understandings and certainties of what was presented and how it was presented. No matter how carefully I design this, no matter how carefully I present it, no matter how strongly I try to create an experience that will be universally perceived, I will fail. There's no doubt of that. Everyone who's lecturing ends up lecturing differently to different audiences with the same lecture. Every website is the same. No matter how carefully you craft it, different people will have different experiences of it. And this is simply because all of the experiences that we have are really incomplete in terms of what we can perceive, as we talked about before. And it's our internal thoughts and expectations that fill in the blanks, the massive blanks, the huge chapter upon chapter of blanks in the rough script outline that is the data that we take in from the outside world. Even our shared experiences are quite different from one another when we think that they're the same, because we might be sharing certain touchstones, but we're only sharing some of them. Most of what we're all experiencing is based on what we are individually feeling. And it's important to remember that what we are individually feeling about ourselves, about the world around us, about each other, that all gets shaped by our own version of the Johari window that we talked about before, the four little panes that define how we see ourselves, how we see each other, how we see the world, the things, the limitations to our knowledge. The funny thing, as I've mentioned several times, and will continue to mention until I learn better, every one of us is intrinsically biased to believe that our perspective is richer and more accurate than everyone else's perspective. Now, I've said that a lot, and I want to be clear. There are people with self-esteem issues who are biased to believe that their perspective is poor, but that's really the exception. And it's a strange psychological phenomenon. I shouldn't say strange, it's an interesting psychological phenomenon that reverses that, that flips that. And I'd be happy to talk about that with anyone who wants to. But for the most part, we have this internal bias to just believe we know better than everyone else and than anyone else and than everyone else, even in groups. On top of that, that internal bias, the certainty we feel then is shaped in this really weird way because of the triune brain, as I've talked about before. So our reflexes respond much faster than we can think, and they trigger the release of chemicals in our brains, in our pineal system, in our other glands, in our stomach. We have these chemicals released that combine over time to change the way that we perceive the world around us. And those shape the way that we feel emotionally about things, and our emotions inform the patterns that we use to understand things well before our logical brain can start working. So the rational brain that we each have, that big wrinkly tablecloth crammed into our skulls, that rational part of our brain, the prefrontal neocortex, it really just does the job of applying all of our rational abilities to coming up with justifications for the opinions we already have formed microseconds earlier, and the mental models that we fit new information into. Finally, as I talked about in the very first of these talks, uncertainty, like in our current situation, causes stress and it causes grief. And it leads us to make poor emotional decisions because we're suffering from stress and grief. Those are the feelings and the associated chemicals that are causing us to make our quick decisions. And then once we've made those quick decisions, we stick with them, unless we get help from sociogenesis, help from ideas from the outside. So, with all of that said, let's finish up this series of talks. And again, like I always do, having said all of this nonsense, let's take a look at how it ties into the triune brain, mostly just to show off this drawing that I'm inordinately proud of. So our reflexes release these neurochemicals, right? They trigger them. If you're surprised, if you're happy, if whatever, much faster than you can think, even faster than you can react, neurochemicals are released. And then these fast reactions that we can do are shaped by those neurochemical changes. And all of a sudden we think we see facts in known patterns. We think we do, but we don't necessarily do so. I'm going to give you an example of that in just a moment. But first, just to finish this line of thought, by the time our rational skills kick in, as I said, we have to decide whether or not we're going to defend these things we're sure of. And deciding not to is really hard. And getting past defending these preconceived or these preformed emotional patterns, it's really hard work. It's possible, like I said, especially through sociogenesis, through help from outside, but it's hard. And it's possible you're thinking, okay, John, you've talked about this before, and I just disagree with it. I know I don't think like that. And of course, my simple answer would be, yes, you do. And then we could go back and forth like the Monty Python skit about having an argument that is actually a disagreement. However, I want to give you an example. Have you ever looked up at the clouds and seen a face or an animal in the clouds? Have you ever been out on the street and heard the rustling of branches as the wind blows, or perhaps the wind blowing through telephone wires and the harmonics that come from that? And you think you hear voices or a familiar song? Maybe instead of in those places, you've experienced the auditory illusion in the shower when the water is running. I have tinnitus and always hear patterns in running water. If I can hear it at all, it's forming patterns. That's that same illusory misconception. That's my brain deciding to. Reshape the noise that it's perceiving into facts, whether or not it should. Now, I'm going to sum that up differently, like I always do, for those of you who need to hear it from another perspective. or want to. Those of you who don't want to, just hit fast forward on the playback. So our triune brain is really what makes it possible for us to live long enough to think deeply about things. That's part of how it evolved. At least that's the generally accepted theory, and I stand with that for now. It's our reflexes that respond really quickly to things that save our lives most of the time. And then it's also because these fast emotional pattern-based reactions that I've just been complaining about and speaking about negatively, well, those things keep us alive too. They're not as fast as reflexes, but they can be better at keeping us alive because they were formed beforehand at non-threatening times, either through cultural norms or through individual learning. We learn to react like this under this stimulus, and if we've learned it well enough, practiced it well enough, then it happens without us thinking. And that's cool, because that's what allows us to bring sociogenesis into play. Those same patterns can be shaped carefully by ourselves when we decide we're going to do something differently from now on. And instead of just deciding it, we then practice doing the different thing deliberately until it becomes normal for us. Or we take on learning from our community, which all of us have done. I can't stare at you like this when I'm talking to you, or else we all feel uncomfortable, even though I'm actually staring at a camera, not at you, and you're actually seeing it on a monitor, not in my face. Still, it makes us feel uncomfortable because we learned over time that's not how you do things. It's better if I look over here now and then and look over there now and then and sometimes look down. If I do these things, then it's easier to follow my seemingly unending speaking. Anyone who has deliberately learned a skill, like playing billiards or martial arts, has gone through hours of practice so that things that had to be done very deliberately at first can now be done much more easily. Musicians go through the same thing, so do dancers, and so does anyone who is forming sounds into speech, just at a slightly different level. All of these things happen faster than we can consciously think about them. So if you want to think of it that way, you could say that we go through most of our lives on autopilot. The vast majority of the things we do every day, we do without thinking about them. And that's a little strange that most of our decisions are completely unthinking decisions, right? Based on what we learned culturally or from our ancestors, what we learned from our community, and what we unintentionally carry on from other sources, from those sources or other sources. But that's what we do. We unthinkingly react to the world, and then we think deeply to try to justify our reactions. I want to talk about that for just a moment before we go further, because you may have noticed that time is passing strangely these days. And I think that's because the world is so unpredictable right now. The normal day-to-day things, as I mentioned in lectures 2 and 3, the normal day-to-day things that we experience that help us self-calibrate, that help us figure out who we are and be sure that we're operating optimally, or at least as optimally as we're used to. All of those things are gone. Beginnings and endings aren't reliable anymore, and the steps between them aren't reliable anymore. And I think that this unpredictable version of the world that we're living in is changing the way that we can think. I think maybe we're perceiving time more like children do, children who are learning new connections all the time, who don't really know what's going to happen next, and learn pretty quickly that trying to predict it just isn't going to work, at least until they get into school and get forced to sit in desks, and all of a sudden predictability becomes the standard. I think maybe that's why time is strange for us right now. Anyway, it's an interesting thought, and I'd be glad to explore it with anyone who wants to talk about it. But the reason I bring it up today is because that unpredictability in the world around us creates an uncertainty in our thoughts, which triggers the release of grief and stress-related hormones, which make it hard for us to think about things when we want to. And you may have noticed that there's been an added burden to your own thinking these days. And that added burden, that increased friction of thinking about things deliberately, makes it easier to just give in to those fast reactions, those fast emotional reactions. Easier to do that, harder to be reflective and thoughtful. And I'm sure all of us can imagine interactions we've had recently, in my case, almost entirely on video, but interactions we've had recently where we've been fast to say things that we wouldn't normally say, or fast to feel things that we wouldn't normally feel in speaking with specific people or interacting with specific people. And that's dangerous, because it's what we think and how we think it that defines who we are, that we are at all, as René Descartes said, and who we are. So cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. Or as you might put it these days, if you like to play with bad church Latin like I do, cogito multum nimis, ergo sum confusus. I'm thinking way too much, and so I become confused. That's cognitive friction. Cognitive friction, to put it more specifically, is the added difficulty of having to think about something that you didn't expect to have to think about. So everything has some cognitive friction. Solving an arithmetic problem gives me more trouble than it gives to my friend Rob, who's listening today, especially if the arithmetic is going on into the depths of quadratic equations or some such thing. There's some cognitive friction there, but having to do that while walking a tightrope adds cognitive friction because of the uncertainty of being able to perform the physical task. Now, knowing Rob as I do, it's possible that he's very comfortable doing those two things at the same time. Let me say that for me, the discomfort would create additional cognitive friction. And this has been neatly measured in a thing called the jam jar experiment that I'm going to talk about a little later. It's about choices and about the multiplicity of choice and the difficulty of that. And it's about marmalade, which interestingly is actually derived in English from a Portuguese word, but we won't go there today. And it's about being jammed, if you'll pardon yet another one of the many promised dad jokes. We'll come back to that later. For now, let's take one last walk together. I mean, one last walk in this series. I'm hoping that I'll be able to walk later with anyone who's listening and watching today or in the future. I like taking walks, and I'd be glad to take a walk with just about anybody. But for now, let's leave the future for the future, as Candide was wont to refer to. And let's take another walk in the past, as Candide absolutely would have said we shouldn't do. Let's go for a walk along Broad Street in Philadelphia. That's really funny. In Philadelphia, PA. In Philadelphia, PA. And let's go back to September 28th, 1918. Now, for those of you not intimately familiar with the history of the early 20th century, and no worries, that was an interesting time. The First World War was on. And on this particular day, the plan was that all kinds of people from the city were going to get together and march in a parade, march in unison, and to do it for a good reason. They wanted to raise funds for the troops who were overseas fighting in the First World War. And all kinds of people were planned to be there. They were going to have horse-drawn cannons, and they were going to have the new type of plane that had floats instead of wheels, so it could land on water, take off from water. They were going to have the Boy Scouts in large numbers. John Philip Sousa was going to be there himself, leading his famous band. He's the man who wrote most of the marches that are associated with this country, and almost every march that's associated with any particular university in this country. If you've ever heard a march sung by Ethel Merman, gosh, I'm showing my age. If you've ever heard a marching song about this country, it was probably written by him. So all of those people were there, and so was the flu. The Spanish flu had actually been in the US since March. And I want to take just a moment to talk about the name Spanish flu, because that's what everyone calls it. And the reason for that is really silly. There are theories that these days that it started in Spain. No. News from the time makes it really clear that it didn't start in Spain. What was going on was that the war was being fought, and a huge number of people, as I'll mention in more detail shortly, all around the world were getting sick. And the news coming back from the front didn't want to report on the fact that this flu was infecting soldiers in the Allied armies. So they talked about it, since they had to warn the home countries, the US, England, Canada, they had to warn the home countries about this flu. They talked about it in terms of a European country that wasn't amongst the Allies, or at least that wasn't where the Allies were fighting. And so they talked about it in terms of the growing infection rate in Spain. And people started calling it the Spanish flu. Now, like I say, people have talked about how it was originally from China. That was a popular one for a long time. Actually, the theory I support so far, out of what I've read so far, and I just refreshed my research leading up to this talk. After this talk was postponed a couple of times, I went and did some reading. There's pretty good evidence that it started in New York, but again, that's not definitive. Anyhow, so the Spanish flu had been in the US since March. Specifically, it had been flagged and diagnosed in some military bases in the Midwest. And because the flu was known to be in the country, many of the doctors in the Philadelphia region said, no, we cannot get 10,000 people together to scream and cheer and crowd together next to each other to watch a parade. It would be a ridiculous thing to do during a pandemic. I hope this is beginning to sound familiar. Dr. Wilmer Cruson was the head public health official for the city, and he and a bunch of other officials on the city council said they would go ahead with the parade anyway because they were doing it to raise money for the war effort. The war effort was more important than whether people got sick or not, and they had already committed to raising over $2.5 million. So they said, yep, we're doing it. And they went ahead and did the parade. And it ended up being the largest parade ever in the history of the city. Actually, 200,000 people came out and they raised $6 million. So it was a raging success, especially for the flu. The day after the parade, 118 people were sick. 2 days later, doctors confirmed that it was the Spanish flu. And the day after that, all 31 hospitals in the city of brotherly love were full. And a week after that, 4,500 Philadelphians were dead of the Spanish flu. Now, I know those of you who've been worrying about COVID like all of us have, you're thinking, yeah, it's way too fast. It's way too fast. Not our flu, a different flu. So 5 days after the parade, the city locked down. They were like, okay, all the hospitals are full. We cannot have more sick people. They locked down. But in the end, 17,000 locals died, directly linked to this parade. It was so bad that they ran out of people, not only to serve in hospitals, as we've experienced at this time, but they ran out of people to bury bodies, as some countries have experienced during COVID. And yeah, that last line is right. Sanitation workers were expanded, the forces were expanded, and they had to take dead people off of the street because bodies were being left where they fell. And it was that fast. This flu killed people really quickly. I was going to mention some of the children's playground songs that came out of it, but I'm not going to. It's a little too black humorish for me. But people died quickly. And in fact, 20% of the world's population got sick by some estimates. It's hard to say because some people had political reasons for not counting the dead or not including the dead amongst the infected. But 20% of the world's population, it's estimated, got sick from this Spanish flu, and 0.5% of the world's population died from the flu. It killed 10 times more people than the First World War, the Great War, the war to end all wars, lest we forget. It killed 10 times more people, but we forgot about it. We put it out of our minds and we didn't teach our children. And I know you're saying, no, that's not true. Everybody knows about the Spanish flu. You don't teach the name of things in order to save people from repeating them. What you teach is how to stop it from happening again, right? Those who do not learn from history. The guidance that was given in those days is the same guidance that we gave now. Self-isolate. Keep to yourself or to your small social circle, your family. Wear a mask when you're out in public. Keep your distance from each other, no matter how well you know each other. Keep your distance when you're out in public. Listen to science. Be patient and self-disciplined. And for the most part, they were. For the most part, that's exactly what the world did for 2 years while the flu raged on all around the world. And for the most part, it worked. Just like for the most part, it's working now all around the world. For the most part, in most places all around the world. But again, we didn't learn, right? As a culture, intrinsically, as learned reflex patterns, we didn't learn. In some places in the world, they did learn. In some places in the world, when cities got more crowded, people took to wearing masks when they were out in public. We didn't learn. We didn't embrace that new knowledge and internalize it and make it part of our mental map and our mental model about how you behave. So we have to learn it again now. So will you go for a walk? Not with me because I'm not there, but will you go for a walk? Will you walk along a beach in California? Will you walk along a hiking trail in Arizona? Will you walk into a bar or a bowling alley or a restaurant or a barber shop or a tattoo parlor or a massage parlor or your hairstylists? Will you walk into any of these places? If you're thinking about doing that, think first, please, about walking into a hospital. Because what we're seeing now is the result of this fast emotional certainty and of cognitive friction. Allow me to explain. Cognitive friction looks like this. Should I wear a mask or not? Well, what does that say about me? What does it say about my politics or about how strong I look or how weak I look? I don't want to look frail. I don't want people to shout out Pelosi's name as I walk by. I probably shouldn't wear a mask. Self-isolate. That was fine for the first few weeks. I watched Netflix and now I've caught up. But I want a haircut. I want to go buy manure and new gardening tools. I want my lawn to look good. I mean, it's my choice, right? I live in a country with free choice still, don't I? I have a right to decide for myself, don't I? I'm willing to die for a haircut and a healthy lawn. We can't let the cure be worse than the disease. We can't do that. Those are strange choices. Objectively, those are strange choices. If you can dissociate the emotion from them, those are just bizarre phrases to even be saying. And it seems that at a time when people are dying because of things they cannot see, things you can't choose to walk away from, things you can't choose to step around, at a time when people are dying from these things, it seems as though these choices should be pretty straightforward. But as I've said again and again, we are not good at slow, reasoned decisions. We're just not good at them. And I hope we've discussed that enough so that that's starting to enter into your mental models about humans as a species and about yourselves. Because having to think more about this, having to worry about that every time you're faced with a decision, just makes the thinking harder. These different types of thinking add up, as I said. Now, some people have talked about this quite markedly. Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper wrote a definitive paper about that, and Barry Schwartz is quite famous for following up on that and discussing it. Let's take a quick look at where that comes from. And somebody who's listening has their microphone on, and the noise is coming in sometimes. If that's not you, I am sorry for interrupting. If that is you, I'm still sorry for interrupting, but I'll carry on. I don't know if you've ever been to Draeger's Supermarket in Menlo Park. I have. Nice supermarket. They've got 300 different jams on display there, or at least they did a few years ago. Certainly they still have plenty. I actually took a selfie inside the jam aisle of the supermarket, because that's the kind of science nerd I am. They set up a tasting booth, and they ran it 2 different ways on different days. People passing by were either offered a choice of 6 jams to choose from to taste things, or they were offered a choice of 24 jams to choose from. And on either day, with either setup, most people only chose 1 or 2. And that's an interesting sociological phenomenon. Most people were probably a little bit embarrassed to be trying free jam, or maybe they were with someone who wasn't into jam. Hard to say, but most people chose between 1 and 2. And the people who had fewer options to choose from bought more jam. Isn't that cool? The people with fewer options bought more. Now, this is a well-understood phenomenon, and I'll talk about it again a bit more, but it's also a controversial phenomenon as of fairly recently, because of an article fairly recently in an American business magazine I'm not going to mention by name, where they criticized the findings of this and didn't claim to be part of an elaborate study that reviewed data and said this just isn't true. I've read the study, and I've read some of the papers that they refer to, not all of them, but enough to see a trend in the papers they referred to. So I'm going to suggest that you consider that this is a simple truth for now. Please do the reading yourself. I certainly encourage that, but my recommendation is that this is a simple truth. If you give people more choice, they are more likely to walk away than they are to use those choices. And this was originally reported in work more than 100 years ago by the Dutchman Franciscus Donders, who talked about how additional complexity of decisions makes decision-making harder, which seems obvious. And some of you, because of where we are and who we are, some of you have heard about similar ideas from Claude Shannon, who you may have heard of for reasons of his information. Sorry, sometimes that happens. For reasons of his information theory. Sorry, Claude Shannon talked about how information can flow, and the movement of information can be blocked by different things. William Edmund Hick and Ray Hyman were 2 psychologists, an Englishman and an American, who tried to take the same ideas that Shannon had talked about, that Donders had talked about, that many others had talked about, and they tried to find a way of measuring that and make a predictable metric that could be used, so that you could actually start quantifying that reliably, in the sort of way we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And they did, and it became clear. More choices slow you down. This is referred to as Hick's law usually, or the Hick-Hyman law. And the fun thing is that it's true even when the choices aren't about one thing, even when the choices come from different problems that happen to overlap. So let's take a look at this. These curves that we've seen before, because everyone's seen these curves, everyone knows what they are, as we talked about in several of the earlier lectures. Everybody knows what they are, even without the labels. You know what they are: the curve that didn't flatten, the curve that did flatten. But by adding some context, we make it more informative, right? By adding some context, they become something we can learn from. Oh, okay, that line is actually critical care capacity, not the number of beds in a hospital. And yep, this is the infection rate with no mitigation. Okay, yeah, that's what I always thought. It's exponential. Okay, right, because all living things will grow in an exponential manner until their food runs out or their living space runs out. Yep, okay, good. And that one, the flatten, oh, right, yeah, that's because you can physical distance, stay home or wear masks and hand wash. Right. This added information makes this easier to understand. But doesn't it make it harder to read? Doesn't it? When you look at it now, there's just too much information there. Especially when you start worrying that we are somewhere around here, as I pointed out a few weeks ago. So back then I said that there's a big learning opportunity coming, because all of us are individually making these quick impulsive decisions that are going to hurt us in the long run. I said that back then, and now it's happened. So let's look at a more complex version of a graph. This one comes from the Financial Times, and it's their own work on extrapolating and combining the data from a number of different sources. You can see that in the slide here, and I'll put some links in the notes. This is a curve that you've seen in a simplified version. Probably if you've been watching the news, you've seen some simplified version of this curve saying, here's where the United States is now. We were on a surge, now we've flattened the curve, and now we're starting to go up again. But there's a problem with this curve. And I'm going to be wrapping up pretty soon, but I really want to make this point. There's a problem with this graph and the way this curve is presented. And that problem has to do with the units of measurement. The x-axis going back and forth along here, this is showing us simple linear count of days. And it's days since the first time that 10-day, or the average over 7 days, sorry, since the average over 7 days became higher than 10. That counts as 0 over here, and then we go to 20 to 40 to 60, all the way down these other days. So some of these countries are sticking out further than others. That's because they had the disease sooner. So they've had 180 days in this case, whereas the US, at the point that this was captured, which was July 5th, a couple of days ago, the US had only had about 135 days of having the disease, with certain absolute measured instances of infection. That's the x-axis. The y-axis is really misleading. Take a look over here at the y-axis. This isn't a linear axis at all. You can see the count roughly doubles at every unit, and some of the units are bigger than others. That's where they've done more than doubling in order to keep the numbers easily recognizable numbers. So in fact, this distance here from where we were at about 110 days to where we are now in terms of the number, that's going from 20,000 infections to 50,000 infections in this little distance. That's 30,000 growth, more than all of the rest of this chart. So it's a misleading chart. So let's see it as it actually looks if we make the y-axis linear. And now you can see currently at about 50,000, 15 days earlier, 20 days earlier, down here at about 20,000. 15 days earlier, down here at about 25,000. And you can see the US is way up here because that's the actual linear count of numbers, adding one after one and leaving the space between them the same. And you can see the difference here. The European Union started the infections earlier than we did, and they surged like we did, but they brought it back under control, right? They flattened that curve. Specifically, you can see Spain, where everybody who knows people in Spain, including myself, worried about our friends, our loved ones there, flattened the curve. Italy, the same, worried about our friends and loved ones there. And all over the news in this country for a couple of months before we started treating it seriously here, but they flattened the curve. And it still kind of looks like, wow, we were flattening the curve and now it's gone out of control. That's not the case. Allow me to show another. So again, now we're around here and we're climbing fast, right? That's not a curve that looks like it's slowing down. Let me show you why this curve seems to have flattened in the middle here, because I don't believe it did. These are some states. The blue line there is New York State. And as we all know, hard hit, disastrous at first, but they pushed back and they flattened the curve. The lines underneath it are New Jersey and Illinois are the next two. And you can see that they flattened the curve. They fought back, they flattened the curve. And then during the time that the curve was flattening here, a number of other states, a few in particular, started building up their numbers. In some cases, like in California, we flattened early and slowed down the count. In other cases, they just didn't have many people arriving there with the contamination. But again, the count started slowly there for that reason. However, right around here, you can see, right around here, they all started to go up. What happened right around here? Memorial Day weekend. All of a sudden, people were saying, hey, you know what? Things look pretty cool. let's relax. And this happened. The number of people infected in Florida now, a couple of days ago, on July 5th, was greater than the number that was ever infected in New Jersey. It's almost as much as the peak numbers from New York. California, which was so well under control, heading towards the numbers from New York at its worst. No wonder the country seems to have plateaued and then increased. It's just the overlap of these separate counts. So, learning opportunities, like I said, we're faced with a lot of them every day, and sometimes they seem overwhelming, but we have to remember that together we can comfort each other. And I know that sounds soft and squishy, but comforting each other will make us all feel more confident and secure. Instead of having the confidence and security that comes from blindly doing whatever you want and then justifying it later, let's have the confidence and security that comes from knowing we're doing the right thing, like our ancestors did in 1918 and 1919. Let's learn to accept the difficult, contradictory information and be the people, even in that setting, who we want to be, the people we can brag to our children and grandchildren about. Yeah, I got through it, and I don't believe I infected a single person. Wouldn't it be nice to say that with confidence that was based on numbers and evidence rather than blind confidence? I didn't infect anyone, no chance. But carrying all of this information together is cognitive friction, because day-to-day life, whether you go to a park or a barber or a shopping center, isn't something you should have to think about. And having to think about it makes things less intuitive than they ever were. But really, was life ever completely intuitive, or were we just fooling ourselves? Because it can seem intuitive if you have limited enough options. That's what Skinner and the Skinner boxes, that's what that was all about, as I talked about a few weeks ago. If nobody challenges your interpretation of what's going on, then everything is intuitive. Ask someone who's never been contradicted. I'm sure we can all think of an example. If nobody's ever told you you're wrong, then everything seems awfully intuitive, and you must be really great at things. But I've found in my limited experience that one of the best things a human being can learn, and again, in my limited experience, the single most life-changing thing I ever learned was that it's actually a sign of wisdom to admit that you don't know things. Admitting that you are ignorant, and that's not an insulting word like it's used in some dialects of American English. Ignorant just means that you don't know things, and like the definition of ignorant. And admitting that you don't know things, it's a real skill. It's a real strength, especially if you allow it to open your mind to the knowledge and feelings of people who think differently than you do. I encourage you to think about the last two lectures in particular, especially the one 2 lectures ago. I'm not saying that that means that you accept other people's ideas unquestioningly, because that way leads disaster. Faith denies proof, if you don't mind me reversing a popular Christian phrase. What we need is a diverse community who can disagree in a congenial way, who can agree to disagree, not meaning now I hate you and I'm not going to talk to you, but agree to disagree means, wow, is that really your opinion? Explain it to me so I can understand it better. And then really listening and sharing your ideas and going back and forth, agreeing to disagree so that you can question each other's ideas and the way that you got there, so that all of us have a full access to the full range of opinions and mental processes from the community around us. And above all, a willingness to have our own ideas disproven in that process. For that to work, we have to have a heterogeneous circle of friends. That means as many differences as possible, as different from each other as possible in our immediate circle of friends. And we have to be able to disagree with each other like that, because the more we disagree with each other and so learn from that process of congenial disagreement, the better our odds of surviving new experiences. But of course, the ideas that we defend have to be well-reasoned. It can't just be that Monty Python argument that I talked about before, where you're disagreeing with each other and shouting about it. The debate also has to be well-reasoned. Because as I've said several times and will continue to say until it's disproven to me, unreasoning certainty stops us from learning, stops us flat from learning anything new. Of course, that's just my opinion. I could be wrong. It wouldn't be the first time today. If you'd like to think more calmly, and if you'd like to help others do the same, then I encourage you to do so. And if I can help you in any way, then please let me know. Thank you very much.